Hi guys, this is Mrs. Foy, and this is a screencast about how you determine what kind of bond is between two different atoms. So there's three types of what we call intramolecular bonds. These are bonds that are in between two different, intramolecular bonds are bonds that are within a molecule. And we have ionic, polar covalent, and nonpolar covalent. And what we need to look at is we need to look at these electronegativities. And what we do is we take the electronegativity, which remember is one atom's attraction for another atom's electrons. And there are some rules for determining what kind of bond it will be by subtracting the electronegativity. So this is the absolute value, so we don't worry about negatives. And there's some rules for determining what kind of bond you have. So let's practice. So if it is an ionic bond, in general, an ionic bond is going to have an electronegativity difference greater than 2. And usually these are going to be between metals and nonmetals. So remember, these are nonmetals over here, and these are metals over here. So for example, if we take chlorine, which has an electronegativity of 3.0, and we have sodium, which has an electronegativity of 0.9, and we subtract those, that's what delta means, we can see the difference is 2.1. And so if the difference is greater than 2.0, then we say this would be an ionic bond. So chlorine is going to steal one electron from sodium. Sodium becomes a positive cation. Chlorine becomes chloride, a negative anion, and it forms a bond between the sodium and the chloride that's called an ionic bond. Another kind of bond between two different atoms is called a nonpolar covalent bond. If it is a covalent bond, then we have sharing of electrons, not stealing of electrons. And the rules are if the electronegativity is less than 0.5. So, for example, if I were to have a hydrogen, which has an electronegativity of 2.1, and I have another hydrogen, which has an electronegativity of 2.1, if I take the difference, that is 0. And so the bond between those two hydrogens is a nonpolar covalent bond, and the electrons are perfectly shared. In another type of covalent bond where electrons are shared, it's called a polar covalent bond. So this is where the electrons are shared, but they are shared unequally. The electrons are shared unequally. And the rules are here is the electronegativity has to be between 0.5 and 1.7. So for example, if I took carbon, which has an electronegativity of 2.5, and oxygen, which has an electronegativity of 3.5, and I take the difference, I get 1.0. And so following those rules, I see that the carbon-oxygen bond, this makes carbon monoxide, is actually a polar covalent bond. So that means that the electrons are shared, but they're being pulled more towards the oxygen, which is a more electronegative atom than carbon. Finally, if the electronegativity is between 1.7 and 2, that's kind of a shady area because we see that some of these bonds aren't specifically one type or another. In general, if the bond is between a metal and a nonmetal, normally we say that that is ionic. However, if it's two nonmetals, then we normally say that it would be a polar covalent bond. So what's an example? So if we take fluorine, remember fluorine is the most electronegative atom on the whole periodic table, and we have hydrogen, which is 2.1. We take that difference, which is 1.9. That's not enough to be considered to be perfectly ionic. However, hydrogen is a nonmetal, so it's over on the left side because of its electron configuration, but it is a nonmetal. And so the hydrogen fluoride bond is very, very polar covalent. And the electrons are going to be pulled more towards the fluorine side of the bond because it is more electronegative. And then the hydrogen end of the bond is going to be more, is going to have has less electronegativity than the fluorine side. So we watched this video in class, but if you haven't and you need to watch it again to refresh your memory, go to YouTube and search Dogs Teaching Chemistry Chemical Bonds and watch the 2-minute video. You should be able to describe the 3 types of bonds that are in the little dog skits and write them down on the assignment paper that I have given you. Finally, you should be able to fill out this table that's talking about the difference between intramolecular bonds, which are bonds within bonds between 2 or more atoms, but between, actually within the molecule. So for example, in water. So if I were to draw water like this, I have 2 hydrogens bonded to an oxygen, and the reason why I wrote it with a little, looks like a boomerang, has to do with something we haven't learned yet. However, this bond and this bond are inside the water molecule. And so these would be examples of intramolecular bonds. However, an intermolecular force, we can actually see, and we're going to learn more about these later, that would be between 2 different molecules. So if I actually drew a bunch of different water molecules, the intermolecular force is a very weak force between one molecule and another molecule. So these little dotted lines that I'm showing you here would be example of an intermolecular force. So, hope that's been helpful, and you should be able to do the work assigned to you in class today. Thanks.